So thank you everyone for inviting me to speak today at this event. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Mortimer History Society for providing the bursary that I got last year, which has been really useful for my research over the past year and will definitely continue to be useful as I move forward for the rest of my PhD. My talk today is going to look at the depiction of the Mortimer lineage within Yorkist iconography of the 15th century. I'm particularly going to look at Richard, Duke of York, Edward IV, and Richard III, with a specific focus on Edward IV as the key figure here. I'm going to look at how each of these people used the Mortimer lineage within their imagery, and how this might have been understood by people who were viewing these images within the documents I'm going to look at. So just as a quick refresher, I'm sure some of you will have seen this many times in your life if you have anything to do with the 15th century, but I'm going to give you a quick overview of the Yorkist claim to the throne, as this is very relevant for my talk. So Richard, Duke of York, is descended from two of the sons of Edward III. He is descended from Edward III's second surviving son, Lionel of Antwerp, the Duke of Clarence, and from Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York. The Clarence line is through two women, which is why he basically doesn't end up being the king initially, because it's not clear at this point whether a woman can pass on the claim to the throne. His Duke of York lineage is via an all-male lineage, so much more legitimate, of course. And this is via his father, Richard, Earl of Cambridge. So for most of his life, York focuses on his York descent, because this is the all-male line. It's only when Henry VI proves to be quite an incompetent king that York kind of ends up feeling excluded from the government and ends up pushing his own claim to the throne forward through the Clarence line, which, as you can see, is also the Mortimer line. So he claims that this is, in fact, the senior line to the throne, and therefore he should be the King of England. Unfortunately, he's killed quite soon after he makes this claim, so it's taken up by his son, Edward IV, after his death. And as you can see, it was successful, as he is Edward IV, the King of England. So that was just a quick run through of the Yorkist claim to the throne, and you can see why the Mortimers are therefore useful. Relevant for this talk. So imagery in the 15th century is key for communicating ideas on things like power, legitimacy, and status. And you can see a kind of example of this in the image on screen. This is a Lancastrian pedigree that was given to Margaret of Anjou around 1445, and it shows basically the House of Lancaster. So this big blue structure you can see in the middle is the House of Lancaster, and at the bottom I've highlighted in red these two figures that you can see. On the left, in the red coloured robe, is Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and on the right-hand side, in the blue, is Richard, Duke of York. So you can see that basically both of these figures are at the bottom with their arms up in the air. So what they are basically doing in this image is holding up the House of Lancaster. And I think this is an interesting piece of imagery because it gives us two pieces of information. Firstly, it shows us that these two people were kind of supporters of the House of Lancaster. They were not against the House of Lancaster, because both of these people were kind of seen as troublemakers to some extent in the 15th century. They weren't afraid of speaking their mind necessarily. They had disputes with other nobles. But you can see very clearly the message here is that they are in fact part of the House of Lancaster. They are supporting it. But they're also, they're at the bottom of the image. They're holding it up. So they're kind of, to some extent, subservient to the House of Lancaster, I would say. So I think there's a very clear message of integration with Lancaster, but also subservience to it. And I hope you can see through this image how imagery could be used in the 15th century to tell a message and make a statement, but also to some extent how Richard, Duke of York, was portrayed by the Lancastrians in 1445, so 15 years before he makes his claim to the throne. So in terms of how York presented himself in his imagery before 1460, he traditionally bore the arms of Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York, who he is descended from. And in 1460, when he put forward his claim to the throne, the Lords actually questioned why he'd done this, rather than stressing his descent from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, from the Mortimer line. His answer is basically that I could have done if I'd wanted to, but, I didn't, because of reasons we all understand. But he doesn't really go any further than that. So clearly, there's a bit of a tricky situation here in him explaining why he's done this. And you can see that this imagery being used here clearly has political significance at the time. But clearly, at this point, he is portraying himself as the York heir, not the Clarence heir, not the Mortimer heir. However, there are some interesting links in manuscripts before 1460. For example, on the left-hand side of the screen here, you can see Giles of Rome's De Regimine Principium, which is a manuscript from the second quarter of the 15th century. It was later owned by Richard III, so it's possible that Richard, Duke of York, owned this earlier, although we can't prove that. You can see that it includes Richard, Duke of York's arms within the image on the screen, but there's also a little Mortimer escutcheon within York's arms as well. So there's a clear link being made here to the Mortimer family. On the right-hand side of the screen is the Clare roll from 1456. Here, York's arms are actually depicted as just his normal arms, the arms of Edmund of Langley, impaled with his wife's Neville arms. York is the third image down in this roll. But you can also see that basically everyone around him, so all his family, are depicted with some kind of Mortimer link. So you've got Edmund Mortimer as the first image, Richard, Earl of Cambridge, so York's father, as the second image. This is his wife, his arms impaled with his wife's Mortimer arms, so Mortimer link there. And the most interesting, I think, is the fourth image, which is York's son, Edward, Earl of March at this time, but the future Edward IV. His arms are kind of half depicted here, ready to be included with his wife's arms when he gets married, but he's very clearly being depicted as a Mortimer. So I think these two documents show that even if York wasn't deliberately pushing his Mortimer claim at this point, there's clearly imagery out there which is linking him to this family line. Badges were also key symbols in the 15th century, and they had political meanings that were understood by everybody, basically. Again, here, York tends to favour images used by Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York. So, for example, the falcon and fetterlock, which you can see, for example, in the two images on the upper left, these are from St Lawrence's Church here in Ludlow. This image was originally used by Langley, and it becomes really strongly associated with York during and after his lifetime. You can also see an extract from Gregory's Chronicle, which talks about York being kind of clothed in clothing embroidered all over with fetterlocks. And you can also see a manuscript in the bottom right-hand side, which was probably owned by Cecily Neville, that also has a fetterlock on the right-hand side. So this is a symbol that's really strongly used by York throughout his lifetime. There's also a strong use of the white rose symbol, which also seems to originate from Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York, who also used it as one of his symbols. Again, you can see a white rose in the manuscript on the bottom right-hand side, and on the top right, you can also see an extract from a document that describes some jewellery Richard, Duke of York, had sold, which mentions a rose enamelled white. So again, the white rose is clearly an image being used by York. So it seems that York, during his lifetime, really did focus on his descent from the Dukes of York. You could argue that maybe if he'd lived longer, he only survived a few months after putting his claim to the throne forward, maybe we would have seen a lot more Clarence and Mortimer imagery to show that line of descent. But unfortunately, we just don't have that because York didn't survive long enough to include this claim within his iconography. His son, however, does use a lot of this sort of imagery during his reign. So as soon as Edward IV comes to the throne in 1461, he produces this huge spate of genealogical rolls to prove his right to the throne, that he has the right to be the king because of his lineage. There's two examples of this on the screen, and I've tried to kind of highlight the bits that are Mortimer related. You can see that there's clear visual prominence of the Mortimer line in both of these rolls. The first one, it's along the left-hand side, where in Lancastrian rolls, you might have got a list of popes, for example, instead. Here, it's very clearly the Mortimer line that's focused on instead. And in the second image, you can see the Mortimer line clearly depicted right alongside the royal line. And in both of these manuscripts, you end up having the Mortimer line connecting in with the royal line at the end in the person of Edward IV. There are also examples of earlier Lancastrian rolls being altered during the Yorkist period in order to basically, again, show this Mortimer descent, show that Edward IV is the rightful king through this line of descent. The one on screen, for example, was produced originally around 1429 to 1433, but it has Yorkist editions from around 1463 to 1468. We can tell that they're additions because if you look at the first image, you'll see that the lines are kind of very straight, very uniform, all exactly the same thickness, look very neat. In the second image, you can see that they are a bit squiggly, not particularly uniform in their thickness. They kind of look a little bit rushed to some extent. These are the additions that were made later by a Yorkist scribe. And you can see in the two, the green and the blue image on screen, this is where the Mortimers have been deliberately added in to this genealogical roll in order to show Edward IV's Mortimer descent, which was not previously included in this roll at all. And at the bottom, all of this leads down to Edward IV, who is sort of ensconced in an image of a white rose at the bottom. So again, Yorkist symbolism as well. So clearly, at the start of Edward IV's reign, he was really emphasizing his Mortimer descent as a key part of his claim to the throne. This one I particularly like because you have a really visual depiction of the Mortimers in this role. So you have a literal family tree in this image where you've got Henry III laying along the floor and all these branches of a physical tree growing out of him, with all of the kings of England and their relatives included within this tree in kind of little pouches. The green square on the tree shows the Mortimer family. So you've got Philippa Mortimer in the bottom right-hand side, who was married to Edmund Mortimer. She was also the daughter of the Duke of Clarence. And then you've got all of her line all the way up to Richard, Duke of York, who I've unfortunately had to sort of cut off because I didn't have enough room to include him in this particular image. But you can clearly see, again, the Mortimers very visibly depicted here as literal people. However, you can also see a couple of other interesting ways that Edward IV promoted his right to the throne within this role. So, for example, in the blue circle, you can see on the left-hand side, Henry IV, who has his sword drawn and is literally sawing off a branch of the tree. This is the branch that contains Richard II. So you can clearly see there's a very definite message here that Henry IV forcibly removed Richard II from the line of succession. And you've got this idea that the Lancastrians are usurpers, they're not legitimate, this sort of thing, and therefore Edward is obviously the legitimate king. You've also got at the top, which I've highlighted in a red box, two figures emerging at the top, kind of about to face off. This is Henry VI on the left and Edward IV with his sword held up before him on the right. This, I think, is intended to show that Edward IV was not just king by right, but he was also a military leader who was willing to fight for the throne, which Henry VI infamously was not willing to do. You know, other people would fight in the name of Henry VI, but Henry VI himself never particularly did anything very useful. So Edward IV here, again, shown also as legitimate because he was willing to fight for the crown of England. One of the most impressive pieces of promotional material from Edward IV has got to be this roll, Lewis E201. This is also sometimes referred to as the coronation roll because it's very focused on Edward IV. Seems to have been produced right around the time that he became King of England. It's got lots of symbols, lots of banners, lots of colours, as you can see in the image. And all of this has some kind of symbolic message that's to do with Edward IV and his claim to the throne. It includes a very visual depiction of the Mortimer descent, and the use of colour here is very interesting. So if you look at the first image on this screen, this is the combination of the Welsh and Mortimer lines. So the dark green colour is the Welsh line with Gladys Ddu, and the bright red is the Mortimer line with Ralph Mortimer, and this is symbolising their marriage. You can see in the second line, these two colours have now kind of combined into a double green-red Mortimer Welsh line. And this has come down to the person of Edmund Mortimer, who is marrying Philippa on the right. Philippa's kind of taken on some of Edmund's Mortimer colours, but she's also got the blue and yellow from her father. So this is the colours of the English king's descent. Interestingly, these colours then basically completely take over moving forwards. So you've got their son, Roger Mortimer, and all of his children. They basically just have the colours inherited from Edward III and Lionel and Philippa. This is quite interesting because in a lot of genealogies, you get the Mortimer Clarence line, but it's just a literal line. So you don't necessarily get this level of detail about which part of the claim was the most important for the Yorkist kings. Here you can see that the most prominent line is the Clarence line, the Clarence colours. So even though the Mortimers themselves were part of this line, it does seem that at this point in the genealogy, what's being emphasised is the fact that the Yorkists are descended from Edward III. They're descended from the Duke of Clarence, and therefore this is why they are particularly legitimate, which makes sense because we're talking about a claim to the English throne, and this is the descent from an English king. These colours all then combine with Richard, Earl of Cambridge's kind of dark red colour, which is the claim to the crown of Castile. And these three colours from the English kings and also from Richard's father's line all combine in the person of Richard, Duke of York, on the bottom right-hand side in the kind of longer rectangle. This shows what we call the triple descent of the House of York. So the fact that they are descended from French, English, and Castilian royal families, and therefore have some kind of claim to all of these thrones, but also particularly just general legitimacy because they are descended from these people. The roll then culminates in a grand celebration of Edward IV and his claim to the throne. Again, you can see the colours from Richard, Duke of York, coming in to form a sort of diamond shape around Edward to emphasise his triple descent. And you've also got the three crowns of England, France, and Spain next to this to really emphasise this in imagery. So at this point, you don't necessarily think you've got much Mortimer left. But actually, if you look at the square shape, which is around Edward's name and claim to the throne, it's a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can see the colour distinctions here. This is actually not the colours of the triple descent. This is the dark green, white and bright red of the Welsh, de Clare and Mortimer lines that previously had been kind of obscured earlier in the roll by other supposedly more important lines, but at the end of this roll, these are all brought back again. I find this quite interesting because there's not really any need to do this at this point if Edward's descent kind of just relies on the people who have become more visually prominent already in the role. However, he does specifically choose to bring back at this point his Mortimer line, his Welsh line, and his de Clare line. So obviously these other family lines have some kind of significance for Edward IV in and of themselves, rather than just that they merged with other family lines and were therefore important. There's also a lot of Mortimer-specific symbols on this roll, which you can see on this screen. I thought I'd just run through a few of these quickly to give you a sense of how prominent the Mortimers themselves are on this roll, rather than just the fact that they are descended from Lionel. So you can obviously see a Mortimer shield and banner here. The banner is impaled with the arms of Normandy. You can see the arms of Ulster as well, which Richard Duke of York, a title which Richard Duke of York inherited from the Mortimers. You can see many white lions all over the roll, which are known as a symbol of the Mortimer family. And interestingly, one of the white lions is holding up the shield of Constantine, the Emperor of Rome, who was thought at this time to be descended from Brutus. The Mortimers were also seen to be descended from Brutus at this time, so there's kind of clear visual imagery to remind us of these claims of the Mortimers themselves, not just of the Clarence element of their descent. You've also got an interesting little textual element within Roger Mortimer's square on this roll, which notes that he was proclaimed heir to the English throne by Richard II. So again, emphasising that the Mortimers were the legitimate heirs to the throne. And there's also these two interesting little dragons next to the joining of the Welsh and Mortimer lines, which represents a prophecy from Geoffrey of Monmouth, which basically said that the Welsh, or the original British people, would rise again in the form of this red dragon, take over the English and become the rightful kings of Britain again. And this is a symbol that Edward IV sort of associates himself with during his reign. And this is something that he clearly doesn't get from his English descent. He gets this very much from the combined Mortimer Welsh descent. So there's a lot of imagery in this role that specifically refers to the Mortimers and Edward's Mortimer descent, and not just the fact that the Mortimers were also descended from Lionel, Duke of Clarence. There are, however, other non-Mortimer symbols included in the roll, which are used to emphasise Edward's legitimacy, which I thought we should mention just briefly, so we can see that there are other ways that Edward is trying to emphasise his legitimacy here. So, for example, the white hart, which is a symbol of Richard II, is included a lot within the roll, again emphasising that Richard II was the legitimate king, not the Lancastrians. We've got the black bull of Clarence, which is related to Lionel, Duke of Clarence, so emphasising that side of Edward's descent. We've got the sun in splendour, which was also used by Richard II, but seems to be a bit more of a personal symbol for Edward IV after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, where he famously saw 3 suns in the sky, and he seems to have used the sun symbol a lot after that. You've got the falcon and fetterlock, which, as we discussed earlier, is a symbol of Richard, Duke of York, so linking himself to his father and his legitimacy. You've got a couple of symbols related to the Dukes of York here, so the arms of Edmund of Langley, the first Duke of York, and the White Rose, which is related to the Dukes of York, so also emphasising his York lineage and legitimacy. And also, interestingly, things like the arms of St George, who Edward related himself to quite a lot during his reign, and which seems to again emphasise this fact that Edward was also a warrior king who took the throne through battle as well as through his lineage. So there are a lot of other ways on this roll that Edward IV confirmed his right to the throne, but the Mortimers were clearly one of the key ones used within this roll. This one I just wanted to go through quickly because this is a genealogical roll produced around 1470. We know this because of which of Edward IV's children are included within the roll. It's a fairly standard genealogy, very similar to the ones we saw from the start of Edward's reign. So the Mortimers are very clearly depicted in the bits that I've highlighted kind of down the side of the roll. And then they merge with the royal family again at the bottom of the roll in the person of Edward IV. Not a particularly unusual genealogical role, but the fact that it's from 1470, I think, is interesting because this is quite far into Edward's reign at this point. You know, you're almost 10 years in. He is, at this point, still emphasizing his Mortimer claim to the throne. At this point, he was undergoing rebellion from his brother and his cousins, so potentially this has made the claim quite important again, to kind of emphasize again that he is the rightful king. But clearly, even by 1470, the Mortimer Clarence line is very important for Edward IV. Also from 1470, this one kind of known to be from 1470 based on the decoration and the style. Corpus Christi manuscript 98. This one also includes the Mortimers very clearly, and they are actually the first non-royal line to be included in this manuscript. And I think this one's quite interesting because they appear much earlier than seems to be necessary. So you can see in the first image here, the Mortimer shield appears to kind of symbolize the start of the Mortimer line. You've then got this big, long line where nothing is particularly happening. There's no reason for it to be this long, and it's only in the third image where things actually start to happen and the Mortimers start having marriages included on the roll, and it actually has relevance being there, but it's clearly made to be much more visually prominent on this roll than actually is necessarily needed. And to emphasize the visual prominence of the Mortimers on this roll, this is not all of the times the shield appears on this roll, but it is quite a few of them. So you can see that throughout this roll, the Mortimers are really included as a very important part of Edward IV's descent, a very key family, and they are included much more than any other noble family at this point. The descent from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, to Philippa and Edmund Mortimer is also seemingly made to stand out very deliberately in this role too. You can see in the red box that I've highlighted on screen, there is a very dark blue line that stems from Lionel and goes all the way down to Philippa and Edmund Mortimer. This is much darker than any other line you can see in the rest of this role. It really stands out. It seems to be a very deliberate choice to highlight this line. So again, the Mortimers are being made to really visually stand out much more than any other family on this roll. All other Mortimer lines are also kind of shown to die out slowly as we go through the roll. So, for example, Henry Percy's Mortimer line is shown to die out in the first image here. The Stafford line from the Mortimers is shown to die out in the second image, as well as Henry VI line, so that by the time we get to the bottom of this roll, all we have left is Richard, Duke of York, and Edward IV as the only legitimate Mortimer heirs and the only legitimate heirs to the throne. So a very visual message being given here. And if we zoom in a bit on the two roundels that show Edward and Richard, you'll see that Edward's isn't quite finished. We don't really know why. But if you look at the text around Richard, Duke of York's descent in the blue box, this actually says that Richard, Duke of York, is both the York heir and the Mortimer heir. So a very clear depiction here again of the fact that both lineages are really vital for the Yorkist claim to the throne. So I've looked at quite a few genealogies now. So just to show that some of these patterns also do appear in other forms of imagery under the Yorkist kings, particularly Edward IV. Edward IV's livery collar is particularly interesting to look at. So livery collars were kind of basically pieces of jewelry worn by royal servants and government officials in this period. Edward IV's livery collar, you can probably see best on the first two images, has kind of alternate white roses and sunbursts. So symbols related to Edward because of his York descent, but he also deliberately includes a white lion as an attachment to the bottom of quite a few livery collars, which we can see from evidence in tomb effigies, for example, as well as paintings, such as the examples you can see on the screen. Again, as As I mentioned earlier, the white lion is a well-known symbol of the Mortimer family, so including a white lion in a livery colour in this way is a deliberate statement of Edward's Mortimer descent, and this is a very visual way of doing it because obviously people will be walking around wearing these collars and this would be seen by other people. It's a clear reminder of his Mortimer descent at this point. And interestingly, this use of the white lion seems to have been quite specific to Edward IV. We don't really get livery collars like this with other Yorkists. As I mentioned, Richard, Duke of York, clearly had some kind of white rose symbolism in his jewellery, but the white lion doesn't seem to have been used by Richard, Duke of York, or, as we will see shortly, by Richard III. So it's very much something that Edward IV focuses on. And again, to emphasize this, so sometimes you'll get illuminations, for example, or carvings of the arms of Edward IV and his wife, Elizabeth Woodville. These can also have white lions included by them. So, for example, the top two images, these are illuminations from manuscripts where you can see at least one, if not two, white lions included alongside them. You've also got a stone compartment from the entrance to Hereford Castle on the bottom right, and then Elizabeth Woodville's seal on the bottom right-hand side, all of which include the white lion. So again, this is a really visual symbol that is being used in lots of different visual ways at this point, so that lots of different people would presumably have a chance to see this imagery and see Edward IV's connection to the Mortimers. One final aspect of Edward IV's rule that I wanted to look at was the reburial of his father, Richard, Duke of York. This was done in 1476, so about 15 years into Edward IV's reign. He's fairly secure on the throne at this point. He's survived rebellions. His rival claimants to the throne are kind of gone by this point. Yet he's still very much emphasising his lineage within this reburial. So as well as a chance to honour his father, this reburial also served as a chance for Edward IV to basically emphasise his own legitimacy as the son of Richard, Duke of York too. He does this again with some Mortimer symbols. So, for example, a white lion banner and two pennons with white lions included on them. In case anybody doesn't know what a pennon is, it's basically a pointy flag as included in the image on the screen. There's also Yorkist symbols, though, for example, white roses, the fetterlocks of his father, the white heart of Richard II. And there are also some extra symbols of legitimacy added here. So, for example, the whole arms of England are included within the reburial. That basically means the arms of the king without any differencing. So, showing Richard, Duke of York as basically the rightful king by doing this. There's also a depiction of an angel hovering over Richard, Duke of York, with a crown above his head. He's not quite crowned because, as we know, he wasn't actually crowned in life. But this is a clear symbolic way of saying that even though Edward IV did not inherit his crown from his father, he did inherit the right to the crown from his father. So I think it's quite a nice way of seeing both the Mortimer symbolism that Edward uses to legitimise his reign, but also other ways that Edward, by this point, when he's quite stable in his reign, is using to show that he is the legitimate king and prove his authority. When we get to Richard III, we have quite a change in the symbolism. So where Edward IV tended to use the white lion a lot, and when we have depictions of Edward IV's arms, there are usually white lions beside the images. Richard III instead uses his personal device of the white boar, as you can see in some of these images on screen. This was a personal emblem that he had chosen as Duke of Gloucester. He could have changed it when he became king if he'd wanted to, but he chose it for the character traits of the white boar, and he decided to keep this when he became king, rather than focusing on something, for example, the Black Bull of Clarence, which would have proved his legitimacy. He didn't do that. He focused on a more personal symbol instead. And you can really see in a lot of different examples that the white boar is very prominent. So again, with livery collars, where Edward IV was particularly focused on the white lion, you have Richard III's livery collars, still with the white rose at the sunbursts, but instead with the white boar replacing the white lion. There's also an image on the right here from the Rouse roll, which shows Richard and his son both being associated with the boar symbol. So it seems to have been something that he was passing on to his son at this point as well. Also in Richard's coronation account, we have an entry recording an order of 13,000 boar badges. So definitely this was the thing that people would have seen. This was the symbol associated with Richard III. However, there's also a mention within his coronation account of 2 standards with white lions being included as well. So there is perhaps a little bit of Mortimer symbolism still being included at this point, but it definitely feels like it's very much reduced compared to what we see with Edward IV. After the Battle of Bosworth, when the Yorkist kings have now died out, there are still Yorkist claimants to the throne, and they seem to at least somewhat take up this idea of the Mortimer line to prove their own legitimacy to the throne again. So, for example, on the screen, this is an example of a Yorkist genealogy from after 1485, which is trying to legitimise the de la Pole claim to the throne. So these were basically Richard III's heirs. The central kind of big thick red line in the middle follows the Mortimer line, despite the fact that it clearly is the most prominent, the most legitimate line on the roll. It's the Mortimers starting from Lionel of Clarence and going down that are depicted as basically the legitimate line on this throne. Whereas you can see in the green coloured box on the screen, this is John of Gaunt and therefore the Lancastrian line. And this is depicted as kind of being a bit off to the side, not particularly important, kind of just peripherally included in the roll. The main line leads all the way down to Edward IV and Richard III, who have these more ornate kind of portraits to show that they are proper kings. Whereas the Lancastrians and Henry VII are all relegated to these tiny little circles that you can see in a couple of images, which have a crown included to show that they were the kings of England, but don't particularly show them as being legitimate or important or anything like this. Henry VII is even kind of shoved right off to the side with this little black line, shown to be very inferior and not very important by these Yorkist claimants. So again, this is clearly a very visual way of showing that the Yorkists are the main claimants to the throne, again, at this point. And it seems probable that this is necessary at this point because we now have a new king on the throne who is not of the Yorkist line, and therefore this claim kind of needs to be brought up again to prove that their claim is more relevant than Henry Tudor's claim. Interestingly, though, when we get to Henry VII's reign, he doesn't ignore the Mortimer lineage of the Yorkists. You can see, for example, in a panel here from St. George's Chapel in Windsor, Henry VII himself is depicted alongside Edward V, Edward IV, and Henry VI. And if you look in the blue box on screen, you'll see that both Edward V and Edward IV both have white lions included in their imagery by their arms. So again, a clear symbol that they were descended from the Mortimer line. Edward V, as you'll see in the red box, also has the falcon and fetterlock behind him, so to show that he was descended from Richard, Duke of York and the Yorkist line. And I mean, it's probable that this lineage wasn't stamped out in any way because Henry VII's wife, Elizabeth of York, was in fact descended from the Mortimer line as well. And you can see here on the screen with the green box that this is her personal seal. It's quite hard to see in the image, but her personal seal does include the Mortimer arms as well. So there's clearly a kind of acceptance that the Yorkists were legitimate because of their Yorkist claim. And to some extent, Henry VII seems to be aligning himself with these earlier Yorkist kings to show that he is also a legitimate king. You'll notice that he doesn't include one particular Yorkist king who he thought was not legitimate. So he's clearly linking himself to the ones that he did think were legitimate. But by taking on this Mortimer imagery and including it here, he's also, to some extent, I would say, subsuming it into his own lineage, his own imagery, because he is now married to a descendant of the Mortimer line. So to conclude, as a quick summary, there's very little Mortimer imagery under Richard, Duke of York. As I said, we may have seen more of this if he'd survived longer. He only survived for a few months after he put forward his Mortimer claim to the throne as being the most important of his lineages. Unfortunately, he just doesn't survive long enough for this to happen, but we can clearly see it being taken up by Edward IV as a key statement of his lineage. However, it's also important to recognise that the Clarence part of the Mortimer lineage was itself very important, as this was the descent of the English kings, and Edward IV was claiming to be an English king. The descent from York was also vital, as was the triple descent from the different crowns of Europe, and also his image as a warrior king. So there were lots of different ways that Edward IV chose to portray himself as the legitimate king, but the Mortimers were a key part of that. And you can see with Edward IV's focus on the White Lion as his personal device that it was seemingly more significant that he was descended from the Mortimers than other Yorkist kings saw this as. Potentially, this is because he was the Earl of March before he became king, so he already has this personal connection to the Mortimers that other Yorkist kings perhaps do not have. When we get to Richard III, he, as I said, changes the imagery, changes his personal device to not have anything to do with his lineage. He also has no big spate of new genealogies like Edward IV had. And it seems like there are perhaps two things going on here. So Edward IV has been on the throne for a long time at this point. It seems likely that the Yorkists would have been seen as the legitimate kings. Edward IV's son, Edward V, had been accepted as the legitimate king before Richard III took the throne. So it doesn't seem likely that he really needed to emphasize this genealogical descent. Richard III's legitimacy actually relied much more on the canon law arguments against his nephews, who he had declared bastards because his brother's marriage supposedly wasn't legitimate. This is much more important for Richard III's lineage than his Mortimer descent by this time, because the Yorkists were seen as the legitimate kings by this point. There's a brief resurgence of the Mortimer claim under the Yorkist claimants following Bosworth, but with this kind of deliberate effort by Henry VII, the Mortimer line basically becomes part of his own descent moving forwards with his marriage to Elizabeth of York, and it thus remains an integral part of the royal line moving forwards. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Gabriella. That was another really comprehensive account of the Mortimers and how important they were to the claims to the English crown. Any questions, anybody? Annie?
Well, thanks, Gabriella. As you can imagine, that was a complete feast for me. Thank you very much. Richard III's boar.
Mm-hmm.
You said that it's purely his personal badge, and you think it's associated with making a personal statement about its characteristics and so on. But is there anything? Has anyone used that boar image in the past? Is there any kind of familial claim associated with this at all, or is it just plucked out of nowhere?
As far as I'm aware, it has no relation to his lineage. I don't think it was a particularly common symbol that people used at this time. It does seem to be something that's just picked purely for its character traits. It certainly doesn't have any link to the Mortimer line, the Clarence line, anything that you would expect him to be emphasising at this point. It was obviously used by other people at the time, but as far as I'm aware, it has no relevance to his lineage.
And what would have been perceived to be at that time the sort of characteristics of the boar? Is it around ferocity and...
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, the boar is kind of a symbol of ferocity, of bravery, of kind of being willing to go into battle and not wanting to give up unless you've won. This kind of, again, slightly warrior imagery, I guess, that you can imagine Richard III having been to war in Scotland and this kind of thing during Edward's reign probably would have wanted to emphasise about himself and might have seen as, maybe more important for his claim by this point than his pure lineage.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
I thought you might have a question, Annie.
Gabriella, my name is Andrew Smith. We haven't met. I was fascinated particularly by the devices. The interesting thing to me was twofold. Firstly, that there doesn't appear to be any consistency in the handing, right, pointing right, facing left, of the white lions. And secondly, that there is also doesn't appear to be any consistency in whether the lions are sort of lying more or less lying down on all fours, or whether they're sort of slightly rampant or even sort of vertically upright in the sense of achievements of arms. Is there any? Have you noticed? Can conclusions be drawn from about either the date or the predominance of particular characteristics at particular times?
This is not something that I've thought of before. You definitely do see the line in lots of different positions, in lots of different ways. To some extent, it does seem to just fit with the layout of whatever you are looking at. So, for example, you have the arms where they're facing different ways because they are just either side of the depiction of Edward's arms, with the livery collars is the word I was looking for. They seem to be depicted lying down, which again just seems to go with the layout of what's the thing that it's being depicted on. I'm not a heraldry expert, so I don't particularly know whether there is some significance to whether it's facing a different way or standing up or sitting down. But yeah, that is something that I hadn't particularly thought of before, that I will be looking into more moving forwards now that you've
Can I reply to that?
Yes, please do.
In livery collars, obviously, because you want a pendant which doesn't sort of drag one way or the other. I mean, a horizontal line is a good thing. There is, but it is interesting. Actually, point of observation. I've just come back. Yes, I was on Thursday. I was in Martley Church looking at the Yorkist livery collar there, on a very worn one on a Mortimer effigy. And it's almost impossible to tell which way the lion is facing. Indeed, if it's a lion at all or a boar. But it's certainly very useful. The other thing I would curious about is whether in fact the same thing is actually true of boards. I mean, have you got any inconsistencies on that? I mean, again, we have the one surviving livery collar on an effigy, which does, as far as I can tell, shows it facing left. But again, that's quite worn. Can I leave you that one?
Yes, I mean, as far as I can tell, the way that the boar itself is positioned is very similar to how the lion is positioned, kind of on the side of the arms. You might have it facing or standing upwards. On a livery collar, it seems to be kind of lying down a bit more. I guess a boar is always in that position if you look at an image of a boar. But yeah, it seems to be that they are in the same positions if you compare different imagery of different animals, but I'm not sure in terms of what those different ways of depicting them would mean at this point.
Thank you very much.
Hello, that was great. I was really interested to see the genealogical table with the De la Pole claimant. I was just curious, do you know of any that were created for any of the other claimants under Henry VII at all?
So I'll go back to it. So this is the only one I know of. I also know of a Percy role that was created around the same time, but these are the only two that I've come across that are kind of just post Bosworth. And the Percy role seems to be much more about showing the Percy line and their legitimacy. It's certainly not a Yorkist role and isn't particularly putting forward a claim to the throne. This is the only one that I actually know of that's from the Delapoles or from any other of the Yorkist claimants in this period. There probably were others, I would imagine, but nothing I know that survives.
They obviously put a lot of effort into creating these roles in order to legitimate their claim to the throne. What audience were these roles aimed at? I mean, people, general public would not have seen these, would they?
So yeah, it's quite a difficult one to answer that because you do have a mixture of kind of visual and textual elements on a lot of these roles. Obviously, if somebody was not literate at this point, they wouldn't have been able to understand the textual elements. But I would argue that, you know, as you can see from the presentation, a lot of the visual stuff does stand for itself. There is also, I forget his name, but there is a historian that's done a bit of research on the fact that there are potentially nail holes in some genealogies to show that they might have been actually put up on walls either in noble households or even in public places. So there was the potential for ordinary people to have seen these kind of roles as well. And it's the kind of symbolism that they would have understood because these symbols were used more broadly. I mean, you can see them in political poetry and this kind of stuff as well. So it does seem like potentially the more ornate ones specifically were intended for public display. For example, E201, the really ornate coronation roll for Edward IV. You can really imagine this being used to display his claim to the throne and not just kind of hidden in the cupboard of a noble person somewhere. So I do think there probably were opportunities for a variety of people to see this imagery and understand the claim to the throne in that way.
Thank you. One thing with regard to the boar, first of all, the boar, of course, was Edward III in the prophecy of the six kings. The boar who would gnash his teeth on his tusks on the walls of Paris. So he may well be harking back. Richard III might well be harking back to Edward III because of the boar. On that very question of the audience, and I do think this is aimed at the literate cognoscenti. Because, I mean, it seems to be an open secret in some parts of the royal family in the early 15th century that Richard, Earl of Cambridge, was conceived on the wrong side of the sheets. There are two independent statements to that effect from the early 15th century, and it seems to be confirmed by the male line DNA of the Richard III body that shows he wasn't descended from Edward III. So, and as we all know, Henry V completely ignored Richard, who he made Earl of Cambridge under some duress. If it's an open secret in the royal family, the entire Yorkist line is actually illegitimate through its Yorkist descent, you've got all the more reason to, impress upon people their legitimacy over and over and over again. And when push really came to shove in 1460 and the Duke of York was fighting for his life, he just made that full switch to look at the line that was not tainted by Richard, Earl of Cambridge's illegitimacy and went full pelt for the Mortimer line. I think that's a personal survival strategy. But also I think everything that then follows on through Edward IV is emphasizing the Mortimer line because it's not tainted by the illegitimacy of Richard, Earl of Cambridge. I wonder if you've got a comment on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the illegitimacy of Richard, Earl of Cambridge in general. I haven't looked into it as much, but I think even the fact that his father was a traitor and, was attainted probably did feed into that as well. It's a line that seems to have a lot more problems in general in terms of emphasizing it for Richard, Duke of York. I think that, you could say that, in some ways there are fewer problems in emphasizing the Mortimer line, but again, it's at the point where Richard seems to have no choice because of his disputes with Henry VI that he has to emphasize this line anyway. So I guess for me, I would say that's the key thing at this point, that he doesn't really have anywhere to go other than to emphasize the Mortimer line. But I guess, yeah, any sort of hints of illegitimacy or attainder or being a traitor or anything like that probably helped to ease him in that direction as well.
Thank you.
Anybody else before we go for a cup of coffee? Anybody? No. Okay. Well, thank you once again, Gabriella, and to